you met Her Majesty on many occasions, I know, and a lot of them would have been in formal settings. Can you give us a sense of what she was like in person?
Well, she had a great sense of humour. She was a lively conversationalist, and she had a wonderful sensitivity towards the different countries that called her queen. I remember my wife and I attended a dinner party at Holroyd Castle in Scotland at the time of a Commonwealth Prime Minister's meeting, and one of the other guests was the then Canadian Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, who was a French Canadian. And halfway through the dinner, the Queen and Chrétien broke into talking to each other in French. Now, I mean, my French wasn't even of the schoolboy variety. I picked up a bit, but it was just the most natural thing in the world for her to do, and it was a gesture of her sensitivity. He was a native-born Prime Minister from Quebec, and his mother tongue was French, but his English was very good. Naturally, have to be a successful Canadian Prime Minister to be fluent in both. But point is that she was very rounded in her understanding of different countries, and she never lost sight of the fact that she was there by the consent of the people. And she would always be very well informed about Australian affairs. Whenever I saw her, she was across the recent political developments in Australia. This is when I was Prime Minister, and she would ask about them, but not in a way that represented any kind of interference, but she was very familiar with things that we had done and things we'd achieved and the challenges that the country had.
She paid 16 visits to Australia. She did seem to have a particular affection for our country. Would you agree with that?
Look, she did have a great affection, and of course she identified with so many of our pursuits. I think the last time I saw and talked to the Queen would have been at Windsor Castle in 2019, and part of the conversation surrounded that wonderful horse Winx, and of course her eyes lit up at any reference to horse racing, which she had a great love of it, and it was something that I must confess I did not have in common, but one or two of my predecessors certainly had in common with her that great love of horse racing, and that enlivened their relationship with her. But she knew a lot about Australia.
I know you gave a tip to Scott Morrison you gave Scott Morrison a good tip to give her a book about Winx.
I did, and she knew so much about the horse, and it wasn't just sort of a pro forma reference along the way. She knew quite a bit about the horse, and by natural inclination, probably more than I did. But that was emblematic of her curiosity about the countries that had her as their head of state, and she was very sensitive to these things, and it's just an illustration of how all-consuming was her commitment. Now, it is amazing that not only she lived for a very, very long time, 96 is an old age in anybody's language, but to the very end, as I've mentioned, she was carrying out her duties and doing her job. She had enormous respect around the world. She lived through the most colossal societal changes in Great Britain and in all countries that were connected with her. She saw the rise and fall when she became Queen in 1952. Joseph Stalin was still the murderous dictator of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would collapse in 1989, and obviously that brought about an enormous change around the world. She dealt with a variety of American presidents. I think probably Harry Truman was still the president of the United States when she became Queen, and of course, memorably, Winston Churchill had come back as Prime Minister just before she became Queen, and I think Liz Truss is the 15th British Prime Minister, and Anthony Albanese is the 16th Australian Prime Minister of her reign. So she's been around for a long time.